finally look to Natalie Samarasinghe to close the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to be here today. When I was a student, I was much more likely to be found in the Purple Turtle or in even less salubrious places than here, so I never thought I'd return as a speaker, let alone a speaker who's 8 months pregnant with my little daughter Guy. I think we have had this evening a very rich debate with valuable interventions from the floor and of course from my distinguished fellow speakers. But I think we've also heard some tired old tropes about the UN, that it's bureaucratic and expensive, for example. Well, in my view, an organization that feeds, shelters and protects millions of people every day, that has set international standards from everything, from human rights and aviation security and everything in between, an organization that takes on difficult issues that others wouldn't touch, an organization that is literally the difference between life and death for so many people, and an organization that does all of this with an annual budget that is less than what the British public spends on Christmas each year. Well, I think that is a redefinition of value for money. We've also heard, and this is important, I think some necessary criticisms of the UN, particularly on cases of sexual abuse by peacekeepers. This is an area where the UN can do better and must do better, even though there are limits to what action it can actually take, given that peacekeeping troops remain under their state's jurisdiction. We have also heard some passionate, shall we say, creative descriptions of how the UN is dealing with Israel and Palestine. It's very easy to cherry-pick facts so that the UN somehow ends up as being biased against both Israel and Palestine all together at once. But it's interesting that both Israel and Palestine continue to seek deeper engagement with the UN, Palestine through membership, Israel, which is running for membership of the Security Council 2018-2019. We have to remember that it isn't UN officials that are criticizing Israel. It's states. It isn't UN officials that are blocking Palestine's membership. It's states. It's not the UN that isn't implementing resolutions. It's not the UN that can't produce a peaceful solution. It's states. We shouldn't shift the responsibility that belongs actually to our governments and to us onto an institution. That's the easy way out. The UN cannot operate in a political vacuum. It's an organization of states. And when states are divided on an issue, especially the big powers, of course it's difficult for the UN to act. Syria is a tragic case in point. UN agencies on the ground are doing everything they can. UN mediators are trying their best to find a political solution. Again, it's governments, not the UN, who are failing the people of Syria, as did people in Bosnia, as did people in Rwanda, as did people in my country, Sri Lanka. The UN has inspiring goals, but they're also lofty. Peace, development, and human rights for all. And I think that's why both its critics and its supporters hold it to impossibly high standards. But the UN was conceived as a very pragmatic response by war-ravaged countries who weighed up the downsides of compromise against the heavy cost of war. It has to respect national sovereignty. Who would accept a world government? Even the much maligned Security Council was designed to avoid the UN going the way of the League of Nations by providing a structure that encourages, and that includes, I'm afraid, the veto, big powers to act within it, not to bypass it. And this structure has proved remarkably durable. The Council remains central to peace and security, and it constantly, despite disagreements, adopts resolutions on everything from sexual abuse by peacekeepers to monitoring the peace process in Colombia. The media loves to report on when it can't act. It often fails to report on when it does act. And the UN is much more than a collective of states. It is a moral voice. That has been exemplified, I think, this year by Ban Ki-moon's championing of LGBT rights, despite huge opposition from a number of states. It is a peacemaker. We've heard examples of this, I think, from both sides, actually, of the debate today. It is an aid giver. It is a norm setter. It is the only truly global platform that we have, where, yes, all states have a voice, where even the big powers need to compromise, where things don't always go their way, where states can come together to try and solve problems peacefully, and where enemies don't just rub shoulders, but actually sit down and work together on shared challenges. So even at this time of heightened tension for the US and Russia, they are cooperating on a host of issues. Is the UN perfect? Of course not. From its handling of whistleblowers who exemplify the many good and principled people who work for the UN, to the protection of civilians in countries such as my own, it often falls short. But that does not make it a failing institution. No organization with a record that includes providing life-saving assistance, eradicating deadly diseases, brokering peace agreements, and building the international system, the very concept of an international community that we have today. No organization that has done all that can reasonably be accused of failing. The consequences of you accepting the proposition, therefore, are very, very serious indeed. The challenges we face today, climate change, extremism, displacement, they require a global organization that can produce global solutions and provide crucial global services. We cannot give up on the UN. We cannot sink into gloom and doom and apathy. And I actually think that probably 3 out of 4 of the proposition speakers and most of the interventions from the floor, the people who gave those, actually agree with our case. You've heard this evening from a handful of speakers in posh clothes. What you haven't heard, who you haven't heard from, I think, or not enough at least, is the millions of people who have benefited from the UN and who continue to place their faith in it. That includes the current Secretary General, as Dina noted, who relied on the UN for education, for medicine, and for protection after the Korean War. They include leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela, who praised the UN's role in helping their own countries achieve freedom and in helping scores of other countries gain independence too. They include children in poor communities who refer to water pumps as UNICEFs. That really gets me. These children see the UN as providing something so essential that it has become part of their everyday vocabulary. They include the refugees from Syria, from Yemen, from Sudan, from elsewhere, who see the UN as their only hope of survival. They include the Tamils in Sri Lanka, who believe it is their only hope for justice. Fundamentally, the UN represents our attempt, however imperfect, to learn from the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust and build an international community that works together. Yes, the UN reflects political realities. And if, at times, we don't like what we see in this mirror, then we, governments, universities, all of us in this room, we need to do more to improve it, to make it more transparent, to make it more accountable, to make it work better for us all. It is so much easier to blame the institution than to put in the hard work we need to make the UN that the world desperately, desperately needs at this time. Or we could just sit back and hope that somehow Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump will get around a table and produce this new institution that will do so much better than what we already have. The choice is yours. Thank you.